On a gloomy night in 1941, in the heart of the North African desert, a handful of British soldiers set out to achieve the impossible. They carried only a few weapons, minimal equipment on their backs, and an unquenchable fire in their hearts. That night, one of the most legendary units in military history would be born. This is the story of the SAS. This is the story of David Stirling. And this story will change everything you thought you knew. If you're new to this channel and want to discover the untold heroic stories of World War II, subscribe now, because the story I'm about to tell will rise from the dusty pages of history and transport you to that desert night. Now let's travel back in time. Late 1940, Europe was being crushed under the boot of Nazi Germany. France had fallen and Britain stood alone. Adolf Hitler's armies seemed unstoppable. These were dark days. But darkness sometimes sets the stage for the brightest stars to rise. It was at this very moment that a man stepped onto the scene. His name was David Stirling. A son of Scottish aristocracy, Stirling was a towering figure at 6 feet 5 inches tall. But it wasn't just his physical attributes that made him special. In his mind, a plan was taking shape that no one could have imagined. David Archibald Stirling was born in 1915 in Stirling, Scotland. He came from a noble family. His father was General Archibald Stirling, and his mother was Margaret Fraser. Young David studied at Cambridge University, but academic life didn't appeal to him much. He was a soul that craved adventure. He dreamed of climbing Everest. He was interested in art. But fate would force him to climb an entirely different mountain. When war broke out, Stirling joined the army without hesitation. He first enlisted in the Scots Guards. However, the traditional military structure stifled his spirit. He wanted to do something different. And this quest for difference led him to the commando units. In 1940, the British commando units had just been established. Created by Winston Churchill's order, these units would raid European coastlines, harass the enemy, and break their morale. Stirling immediately wanted to be part of this new formation, and he joined a commando unit called WWII Force. WWII Force was sent to North Africa and the Middle East in early 1941. The unit's commander was an experienced officer named Robert Laycock. Stirling served as a lieutenant in this unit. But the situation in North Africa was far from bright. German General Erwin Rommel and his Afrika Korps were sweeping across the desert like a storm. British forces were constantly forced to retreat. Rommel's tank units advanced like an unstoppable force. Egypt was under threat. The Suez Canal was in danger. And if Suez fell, Britain's connection to India and the Far East would be severed. This would be a catastrophe that could change the course of the war. It was during this critical period that the WWII Force unit participated in a series of failed operations. The evacuation operation in Crete was a complete fiasco. The unit suffered heavy casualties. Morale had collapsed, and in the summer of 1941, WWII Force was officially disbanded. But at this very point, fate intervened. Stirling had an accident during a parachute jump. His parachute didn't open properly, and he made a hard landing. He injured his legs. Doctors said he would need to stay in bed for months. For a normal person, this would have meant the end of the war. But David Stirling was no ordinary man. While lying at his hospital bed, Stirling began to think, why were they failing? Why weren't the commando raids working? The answer was actually simple. Too many men, too much ships, too much noise. The enemy saw them coming, heard them, and was prepared every single time. And at that moment, a light bulb went off in David Stirling's head. What if they did the exact opposite? What if they used small teams instead of large forces? What if they infiltrated by land or air instead of by sea? What if they became invisible? Stirling began writing a memorandum from his hospital bed. This document would become one of the most important in military history. Stirling proposed a small, highly trained unit capable of independent action. This unit would infiltrate deep behind enemy lines, attack airfields, fuel depots, and communication lines, then vanish. They would come like shadows, strike like a storm, and disappear like smoke.
But there was a problem. Who would he present this plan to? Stirling was just a lieutenant, and the Army hierarchy didn't look kindly on young lieutenants walking up to generals' desks. Besides, he wasn't even allowed to leave the hospital. But David Stirling was a man who didn't get along well with rules. One day, leaning on his crutches, he escaped from the hospital. His target was the Middle East Forces headquarters in Cairo. But the headquarters was surrounded by wire fences and sentries were everywhere. There was no way he could enter through the normal gate, because he didn't have a valid pass. Do you know what Stirling did? He dropped his crutches and crawled under the wire. Yes, you heard that right. Despite his injured legs, he infiltrated the British Army's most important headquarters by crawling under the fence. This perfectly summarized his character. There was no such thing as impossible. After entering the headquarters, Stirling began walking through the corridors. He knew who he was looking for. He wanted to reach Commander-in-Chief General Claude Auchinleck. But first, he was caught by an aide. The man was about to hand Stirling over to security when Stirling managed to convince him he only wanted 5 minutes. 5 minutes that would change the course of the war. Eventually, Stirling managed to meet with Deputy Chief of Staff General Neil Ritchie instead of General Auchinleck. Ritchie listened to this tall, wounded young officer with eyes blazing with fire standing before him. Stirling's plan was bold. Some might even call it madness. But a glint appeared in Ritchie's eyes. The plan was this. A small unit of 65 men would be formed. This unit would be specially trained. They would infiltrate behind enemy lines by parachute or by land. Their targets would be Rommel's most valuable assets, the airfields, because the success of Rommel's tank columns depended on air superiority. German Luftwaffe aircraft constantly bombed British units. If these aircraft could be destroyed on the ground, Rommel's advantage would disappear. Ritchie forwarded the plan to Auchinleck, and incredibly, the plan was approved. Stirling had received authorization to make his dream a reality. Now, all he had to do was build his unit and achieve the impossible. If you're enjoying this story, hit that like button and subscribe. Thank you. In July 1941, L Detachment Special Air Service Brigade was officially established. The name was deliberately misleading. There actually was neither a brigade nor an air force. This was a name invented to deceive the Germans. They wanted them to believe that Britain had a large paratrooper force. And this deception worked perfectly. Stirling's first task was to find men. But he didn't want just any men. He wanted the best. The toughest, most resilient, most intelligent, most loyal. This meant men who could fight against the scorching heat of North Africa, against thirst, against hunger, and against the enemy all at once. Stirling began gathering his old comrades from the disbanded Lay Force. The first and most important name was Jock Lewis. Lewis was an intellectual who had captained the rowing team at Oxford, but he was also a ruthless warrior. And more importantly, he was a genius with explosives. Lewis wasn't immediately convinced by Stirling's plan. Their personalities were very different. Stirling was a charismatic and somewhat disorganized leader. Lewis was disciplined, meticulous, and perfectionist. But that's exactly why they would make a perfect team. Stirling spent hours convincing Lewis. Finally, Lewis agreed, and this agreement would be one of the most important decisions in SAS history, because Lewis was not just a warrior, but also an inventor. The training camp was established at Kabrit, near the Suez Canal. Exactly what Stirling wanted. No one would disturb them, and no one would see what they were doing. From day one, the training was like hell. Stirling and Lewis pushed the men beyond their limits. Runs starting before dawn, marches in the desert heat, night navigation, weapons training, close combat. Every day, every hour, every minute was a test.
But the most challenging part was parachute training, because there was neither a proper training program nor suitable equipment. Stirling and his men had to invent everything from scratch.
The first parachute jumps were made from moving trucks. Yes, you heard that right. The men learned to roll by jumping from trucks traveling at 30 miles per hour. During this training, 2 men lost their lives. Their parachutes didn't open properly and they crashed to the ground. This tragedy shook the unit's morale. But Stirling didn't give up. They learned from their mistakes, corrected their procedures, and continued, because they didn't have the luxury of stopping. Rommel was getting stronger every day. Meanwhile, Jock Lewis was quietly making a revolution. Standard military explosives weren't suitable for aircraft sabotage. They were too heavy and difficult to carry. Lewis locked himself in his laboratory and experimented for weeks. Finally, he developed a new explosive of his own invention. This explosive was called the Lewis bomb. It consisted of a mixture of thermite, plastic explosive, and motor oil. It was small, lightweight, and a bag full of bombs could destroy dozens of aircraft single-handedly. The Lewis bomb would become the SAS's signature weapon. Training continued for weeks. They had started with 65 men, but by the end of training, only the best remained. These men were no longer ordinary soldiers. They were ghosts of the desert, shadows belonging to the night, and they were ready to become Rommel's worst nightmare. By November 1941, Stirling and his men were ready for their first real operation. The targets were 5 German and Italian airfields. These airfields in the Gazala and Tamimi regions were considered the heart of Rommel's air power. The plan was for 5 separate teams to attack these airfields on the same night. A simultaneous operation would shock the enemy. But nature had other plans. A few days before the operation, weather reports started coming in. A storm was approaching, a terrible desert storm. Winds would reach 60 miles per hour. Visibility would drop to 0. The smart thing to do was to postpone the operation, but Stirling refused. The Crusader offensive would begin, and the SAS had to be there. Besides, the storm could be their ally. The enemy wouldn't expect anyone to attack in such weather, and the SAS was created to do the unexpected. On the night of November 16, 1941, 55 men boarded 5 Bristol Bombay aircraft. David Stirling led the way. His most trusted men were with him: Paddy Mayne, Jock Lewis, and others. These men were embarking on one of the boldest operations in history. When the planes took off, the storm had already begun. Thunder, lightning, and terrible turbulence. The planes shook as the men struggled to hold on. The pilots fought to maintain navigation. And then it was time to jump. Into the darkness, into the heart of the storm, into the unknown. One by one, they leapt from the door. Their parachutes opened, and the wind scattered them in every direction. What happened in the desert that night? Was the first operation successful? Did Stirling and his men survive? The answers to these questions will come in part 2. But I can tell you this: what happened that night would be called legendary in military history books. And David Stirling and his men would go down in history as unforgettable heroes. Stay tuned to our channel for part 2, because the real story is just beginning. Don't forget to subscribe and like.
Welcome back to part 2. We continue with this remarkable story. In part 1, we talked about what a visionary David Stirling was. You watched him leave his hospital bed, crawl under the wire, convince the generals, and establish the SAS. Now we're going to that dark night, November 16, 1941, right into the heart of the storm. And believe me, what happens in this episode will keep you on the edge of your seat. If you're enjoying this video, please hit the like button and help us reach more people with this story. Now let's go back to that night. The Bristol Bombay aircraft were advancing through the pitch-black sky of North Africa. The men inside could barely see each other's faces. The plane was shaking constantly. The turbulence was so severe that some men had started vomiting. But no one complained, because these men had forgotten how to complain. David Stirling sat near the door of the aircraft. His eyes were fixed on the darkness, his thoughts on what would happen in a few hours. The plan was simple. They would parachute down, meet at the designated assembly point, march to the airfield, bomb the aircraft, and disappear into the desert. Simple. But in war, no plan survives contact with the enemy. And that night, the enemy wasn't just the Germans. The enemy was nature itself. It was past 11 o'clock at night when the pilot gave the signal. They were approaching the drop zone. Stirling stood up. He looked at his men. These were the faces he had sweated with, suffered with, sometimes laughed with for weeks. Now they were all looking at him, with trusting eyes, and Stirling swore he would not betray that trust. The red light came on. Stand by. The green light, jump. Stirling leaped from the door, and for a moment he felt time stand still. Then the wind caught him. But this wasn't ordinary wind. This was a monster, a merciless force blowing at over 60 miles per hour, hurling everything in its path. When his parachute opened, Stirling completely lost control. The wind was tossing him around like a rag doll. The desert was below, but it was impossible to predict where he would land. And then he hit the ground. A hard landing. The breath was knocked out of him. For a moment, everything went black. When he came to, his parachute had inflated in the wind and was dragging him across the desert. Sharp rocks and thorny bushes were tearing his skin. He desperately tried to cut the parachute lines. Finally, he succeeded and escaped the wind's grasp. He looked around. Darkness, storm, and no one in sight. Where was the rest of his team? Stirling pulled out his whistle and gave the prearranged signal. 3 short, 1 long. He waited. No answer came. He tried again. Silence again. The howling of the storm swallowed everything. This was the first collapse of the plan. The wind had scattered the men over a wide area. Some had been blown miles away. And in the darkness, in the storm, finding each other was nearly impossible. Stirling began to walk. He determined the direction of the assembly point with his compass and advanced step by step. Sand particles were being hurled at his face. He could barely open his eyes. Every step was torture. But he didn't stop. He didn't have the luxury of stopping. About an hour later, a figure appeared in the darkness. Stirling reached for his weapon. But as he got closer, he saw a familiar face. Johnny Cooper, one of the youngest members of the unit. He was only 19 years old, but had the heart of a lion. Cooper was in bad shape. He had injured his shoulder during landing, but he wasn't complaining. He just smiled and said, "Nice night for a walk, isn't it, sir?" That was the SAS spirit, being able to joke even in the middle of hell. As the hours passed, the other men reached the assembly point one by one, but the numbers were far below expectations. Stirling's team was 11 men. Only 4 had made it to the assembly point. The others were injured, lost, or the storm had blown them to unknown places. And the situation was even worse for the other teams. Jock Lewis's team had been completely scattered. Lewis himself had landed safely, but he couldn't find his men. He walked through the desert for hours, searching, calling out. The storm swallowed his voice. By dawn, he only had 2 men with him. Paddy Mayne's situation was slightly better. The Irish giant had landed as if defying the storm. He had managed to gather most of his team, but most of the equipment was lost. Explosives, weapons, supplies. The wind had scattered them all across the desert. But the most tragic loss happened to Charles Bonington's team. Bonington and 2 of his men lost their lives when their parachutes didn't open properly during the jump. The violence of the storm had tangled the parachutes in a chaotic mess. And these 3 brave men died before even seeing the enemy. The total loss was horrific. 22 of the 55 men were out of action before the operation even began. Some had died, some were injured, some were lost, and most of the survivors were without equipment and exhausted. A normal commander would have aborted the operation at this point. He would have retreated, licked his wounds, and returned another day. But David Stirling was not a normal commander. And that night, he made a decision that would go down in history. "We continue," he said. The men beside him looked at him. Was he joking?
Were they going to attack an airfield with hundreds of enemy soldiers with 4 men, half-broken equipment, and in an exhausted state? Stirling's answer was clear. We've come this far. We're not turning back. And so a tiny group began marching toward the target in the darkness of the desert. Ghazal Airfield was approximately 30 kilometers away. They had to reach it before dawn. Otherwise, they would be caught in the open desert in daylight, and that meant certain death. The march was a slice of hell. The storm had calmed somewhat, but the wind was still blowing. Feet sank into the sand. Every step required the energy of 2. The load on their backs dug into their shoulders. But no one stopped. No one fell behind. Hours later, a light appeared on the horizon. The airfield. They were approaching the target. Stirling signaled his men, and everyone dropped to the ground. He began examining the airfield through binoculars. What they saw was discouraging. The airfield was much better protected than he had expected. There were sentries all around the perimeter, searchlights illuminated the area, and worst of all, because of the storm, the aircraft hadn't been brought out of the hangars. There were no planes waiting in the open air. They were all in enclosed spaces. This completely upended the plan. The Lewis bombs were designed for aircraft standing in the open air. Infiltrating the hangars was a much riskier and more difficult task. If this story excites you, don't forget to like and subscribe. Stirling thought for long minutes. He weighed the options, and finally he made a painful decision. They would abort the operation. But this wasn't defeat. This was a strategic withdrawal. Attacking protected hangars with 4 men, no equipment, passing through dozens of sentries would be suicide. And Stirling would not get his men killed for nothing. "We're going back," he said. There was pain in his voice, but there was also determination. This would not be the end. They would return, and next time they would be prepared. The return journey was even harder than the way there. Now exhaustion had also set in. Thirst, hunger, fatigue, everything had collapsed at once. But they walked. Without stopping, without complaining, they walked. The rendezvous point was coordinates designated in the middle of the desert. There, vehicles from the Long-Range Desert Group, the LRDG, would be waiting for them. The LRDG were experts of the desert. With their modified trucks, they could reach the most remote corners of the desert. And for the SAS's operation, they were providing transport and extraction support. When Stirling and his men reached the rendezvous point, the LRDG patrol was waiting for them. This team under Captain David Lloyd Owen's command was a true lifesaver. Water, food, and most importantly, safety. They could finally breathe easy. But there was no time to relax. They needed to learn the status of the other teams. And the news was not encouraging at all. Paddy Mayne's team had never reached the airfield. The storm had blown them so far off course that they had completely missed their target. Jock Lewis had faced a similar fate. His team was scattered, his equipment lost, and the operation was over before it began. As a result, the plan for simultaneous attacks on 5 airfields had completely collapsed. Not a single aircraft had been destroyed, and 22 of the 55 men had been lost. On paper, this was a complete disaster. A total failure. In the headquarters in Cairo, this news caused shock. Many senior officers thought the SAS project should be terminated. So many losses, so much failure. Perhaps Stirling's ideas only looked good on paper. Perhaps they didn't work in practice.
Do you think they will succeed after this operation? Share your thoughts in the comments. But David Stirling didn't give up. When he returned to Cairo, he immediately went on the defensive. He analyzed the cause of the failure. The problem wasn't the concept. The problem was the parachute drop. Even without the storm, parachuting behind enemy lines was too risky a method. It scattered the men over a wide area, it caused equipment loss, and most importantly, it depended on too many variables. Stirling proposed an alternative method, partnership with the LRDG. Instead of parachuting, they would infiltrate behind enemy lines using LRDG desert vehicles. This method was much more reliable. The team would stay together, equipment would be preserved, and most importantly, the return would be guaranteed. This proposal changed the fate of the SAS. Headquarters agreed to give them another chance, and Stirling immediately began preparations. In early December 1941, new operations were planned.
This time, targets were chosen more carefully, intelligence was better, and most importantly, the transportation problem was solved. The first new operation took place on December 14, 1941. The target was Tayment Airfield near Sirte, and the person who would lead this operation was Paddy Mayne. You need to know a few things about Paddy Mayne. This man came from Belfast, Ireland. He was a giant at 6'3", over 200 pounds. But he was a giant not just physically, but spiritually as well. Before the war, he had played for the Irish national rugby team. He had studied law, but he loved action more than books. Mayne was a man who carried a quiet rage. He appeared calm on the outside, but there was a volcano inside him. And when that volcano erupted on the battlefield, hell opened up for the enemy. That night, Mayne and his 10 men approached Tayment Airfield in LRDG vehicles. The plan was simple. They would drive to within a few kilometers of the airfield, then infiltrate on foot. They would place the Lewis bombs on the aircraft and disappear into the darkness. And this time, everything went according to plan. After midnight, Mayne and his team reached the perimeter of the airfield. They carefully observed the sentries, they learned the patrol routes, and with perfect timing, they infiltrated. On the airfield, there were dozens of aircraft parked in the open, German Messerschmitts, Italian Fiats. They were all lined up in rows, ideal for placing bombs. Mayne split his team. Each man would sabotage a certain number of aircraft. Lewis bombs were placed under the wings, in the engine compartments, next to the fuel tanks. 5-minute fuses were set, and then the withdrawal began. But at that very moment, something unexpected happened. Mayne noticed a light on in a building. There was movement inside. This was the pilot barracks. German pilots were sleeping inside. A normal soldier would have stuck to the plan. The target was the aircraft, not the pilots. But Paddy Mayne was not a normal soldier. Mayne walked alone to the barracks door. He kicked it open and burst inside. He had a Colt pistol in his hand, but when he ran out of ammunition, he dropped the gun and continued fighting with his fists. Yes, bare-handed, in the darkness, in the middle of chaos, he grappled with German pilots. What exactly happened in that room was never fully clarified. Mayne didn't like to talk about it. But the result was obvious. When the barracks fell silent, Mayne walked out. His clothes were torn, his face was scratched, but he was standing. And then the fuses started detonating. 1, 2, 3. Explosions in succession. The airfield lit up. Flames rose to the sky. Aircraft were exploding one by one. Fuel tanks were detonating. Ammunition was catching on fire. Total chaos. German and Italian soldiers were running around in panic, but they didn't understand what was happening. An air raid? Sabotage? An accident? They had no idea because the enemy had already vanished into the darkness. When Mayne and his team returned to the rendezvous point, they had left a burning airfield behind them. 24 aircraft had been destroyed. 24. In a single night, a single operation, and most importantly, not a single casualty had been suffered. This was the SAS's first real success, and it was just the beginning. That same night, David Stirling was also carrying out his own operation. The target was Sirte Airfield, and the results were as impressive as Mayne's. Stirling and his team infiltrated the airfield without incident. The sentries were in complete night shift relaxation. No one knew that a small group of British soldiers was moving through the darkness. The team worked systematically. A Lewis bomb was placed on each aircraft, fuses were set, and then they silently withdrew.
When the explosions began, Stirling and his men were at a safe distance. They watched the flames lighting up the sky. And at that moment, a smile appeared on Stirling's face. He was right. The concept worked. Small teams could achieve big results. That night, Stirling's team destroyed 14 aircraft. In total, 38 German and Italian aircraft had been destroyed in a single night. A heavy blow had been dealt to Rommel's air power, and most importantly, the SAS had proven itself. If you enjoyed this raid, don't forget to like and subscribe. When the news reached Cairo, there was shock at headquarters. But this time it was a positive shock. Stirling's crazy ideas actually worked, and now no one was talking about shutting down the SAS. On the contrary, Stirling was given more men and resources. The SAS began to grow, and the coming months would be the period when the legend was truly written. The rest of December was filled with operation after operation. Mayne, Lewis, and Stirling were attacking an airfield almost every week. Each operation was bolder,
riskier and more successful than the last. In one operation, Jock Lewis and his team accidentally landed in the middle of an Italian garrison. Under normal circumstances, this meant certain death, but Lewis kept his cool. He quietly withdrew his team and returned to the same target the next night. This time, they succeeded. In another operation, Paddy Mayne entered a hangar alone. Inside were aircraft that hadn't yet been fully assembled. He sabotaged every single one of them. Within 30 minutes, 12 more aircraft had been added to the list. And David Stirling was on the front lines in every operation. Leadership for him wasn't something done from behind a desk. He infiltrated with his men, fought with them, took risks with them. This was embedded in the SAS's DNA. Leaders lead from the front. But war isn't just about victories. There are losses, too. There is pain, too. December 31st, 1941, the last day of the year. Jock Lewis and his team were returning from an operation. They were advancing through the desert in LRDG vehicles. Everything seemed fine. And then, death came from the sky. A German reconnaissance aircraft had spotted the convoy. The pilot radioed the report, and Messerschmitt fighter planes appeared shortly after. In the middle of the desert, there was nowhere to hide. The vehicles were open targets. The planes made low passes and opened fire. Machine gun bullets tore through the sand. Vehicles were thrown about. Men fell. Jock Lewis lost his life during the attack. One of the founding fathers of the SAS, the brain of the unit, the inventor of the Lewis bomb, David Stirling's closest friend, he was buried in the sands of the desert. This loss deeply shook Stirling. Lewis was not just a warrior, but also the soul of the unit. He had designed the training programs, he had established the discipline, and now he had closed his eyes to life. But the SAS wouldn't stop. It couldn't stop. Lewis's legacy had to continue. And it did. By early 1942, the SAS had become the most feared unit in North Africa. The Germans had set up special teams to catch these mysterious saboteurs. Rommel personally requested briefings about the SAS. But every time, these ghosts were one step ahead. In just a few months, the SAS had destroyed hundreds of enemy aircraft. They had blown up fuel depots. They had cut communication lines. And most importantly, they had crushed the enemy's morale. Because now, German and Italian soldiers were restless even while sleeping at night. There could be an SAS soldier in every shadow. Every dark corner could carry death. This psychological effect was even greater than the physical damage. David Stirling's vision had become reality. Small teams could achieve big results, and this idea would forever change the course of military history. So, what happened next? How did the SAS become a legend? What was David Stirling's fate? And how does this unit continue to live on today? The answers to all these questions await you in the third and final episode. If you're curious about the continuation of the story, stay right here.
We've arrived at the final part of the story. In Part 1, you saw David Stirling's vision. In Part 2, you witnessed that vision being tested by fire. Now we come to the finale of this story. But let me tell you this is not an ending. This is the story of a beginning. Because the spirit born on those desert nights is still alive today. It flows through the veins of special forces around the world. And in this episode, you'll see how that spirit became immortal. If you've been watching this series from the beginning, now is the perfect time to hit the like button and subscribe. Help us reach more people with this story. By early 1942, the SAS was much more than a handful of crazy soldiers. They had become an official unit. They had resources, they had reputation, and most importantly, they had struck fear into the heart of the enemy. David Stirling didn't rest on this success. He always thought bigger. Bolder plans, riskier operations, bigger targets. And 1942 would be one of the brightest periods of this vision. From January onwards, operations continued without slowing down. SAS teams were attacking an enemy facility almost every week. Airfields, fuel depots, communication centers, railway lines. No target was safe, no night was peaceful. In one operation, Stirling and Mayne worked together. The target was Burqa Airfield. This airfield was the center of Rommel's air operations. It was heavily guarded. Dozens of sentries, searchlights, minefields. Under normal circumstances, attacking such a target would be madness. But for the SAS, madness was just another day. The team infiltrated in the darkest hours of the night. They carefully crossed the minefields, they silently neutralized the sentries, and then they reached the aircraft park. That night, 37 aircraft were destroyed. 37 in a single operation. This was one of the most successful raids in SAS history, and the report that landed on Rommel's desk drove the general to fury. German command was trying every method to stop these mysterious saboteurs. Patrols were increased, security protocols were tightened, special hunter teams were even formed, but nothing worked. The SAS was always one step ahead. What was the secret of this success? How could a handful of men leave an entire army helpless? The answer was hidden in the SAS's DNA. This unit was not an ordinary military formation. This was a place where the best of the best gathered. Every man was a master in his field. Navigation, explosives, close combat, survival, and together they worked like a perfect machine. But it wasn't just about individual talents. The SAS's true strength was in its mindset. These men didn't recognize the word impossible. For them, every problem had a solution. Every obstacle was a ladder waiting to be climbed, and every failure was a lesson for the next victory. David Stirling was the living example of this mindset. He never chose the easy path. He preferred the riskiest plans, because he knew that the enemy also expects the easy thing. The unexpected always provides an advantage. By mid-1942, the SAS's record was incredible. Hundreds of enemy aircraft had been destroyed. Countless vehicles, depots, and facilities had been sabotaged. And all of this had been achieved with just a few dozen men. In terms of cost effectiveness, the SAS was probably the most efficient unit of the war. These successes caught the attention of senior commanders. The SAS was no longer just an experiment. The SAS was now a strategic asset, and Stirling was given authority to expand his unit. New men joined, new equipment arrived. The SAS went from being L Detachment to becoming the 1st SAS Regiment. This was official recognition. They now had regimental status. But growth brought its own challenges. More men meant more logistics. More operations meant more risk. And Stirling was constantly struggling to maintain the balance. During this period, SAS tactics also evolved. They were no longer just attacking airfields. The range of targets had expanded. Port facilities, command centers, supply convoys, everything was a target.
The road wash operations became particularly legendary. SAS teams hid in the desert and monitored German supply routes. They recorded every truck, every tank, every convoy that passed. This intelligence was worth gold to British command. Knowing where and how much force Rommel was deploying could change the course of the war. And sometimes they didn't just watch. Sometimes they attacked. One night, Stirling and 8 of his men ambushed a German convoy. The convoy had 12 trucks. They were carrying ammunition, fuel, and supplies. Under normal circumstances, attacking such a large convoy wouldn't be wise. But Stirling had a plan. The team laid mines on both sides of the road. Then they positioned machine guns at strategic points. And they began to wait. When the convoy appeared, Stirling gave the signal. The first truck hit a mine and blew up. The last truck met the same fate. The middle section was caught between 2 fires. And the SAS machine guns began to speak. The firefight lasted 10 minutes. 10 minutes later, all 12 trucks were burning. The German soldiers had either died or fled, and the SAS team had vanished into the darkness of the desert without a single casualty. Successes like these made Stirling fearless, perhaps too fearless, because at the beginning of 1943, fate came knocking. January 1943, Stirling was deep in the desert for a new operation. The objective was to scout enemy lines in Tunisia and identify possible sabotage points. He had set out with a small team, but this time luck was not on his side. A German patrol spotted Stirling's vehicle. A chase began. Stirling tried to escape, but that part of the desert was under enemy control. There was nowhere to take shelter. Finally, they were cornered in a valley. Stirling and his men fought to their last bullet, but they were vastly outnumbered, and finally the inevitable happened. What do you think will happen now? Share your predictions in the comments. David Stirling was captured. This news was a shockwave for the SAS. Their founder, their leader, their source of inspiration was gone. He was in a German prison camp behind barbed wire. But Stirling didn't give up even in the prison camp. He made exactly 4 escape attempts. He was caught every time, he was punished every time, but he tried again every time. The Germans finally transferred him to Colditz Castle. This was where the most dangerous and most stubborn prisoners were held. He even tried to escape from this castle where escape was considered impossible. He didn't succeed, but he never gave up. Stirling spent the rest of the war as a prisoner, but the SAS continued without him. Command was handed over to Paddy Mayne, and Mayne fulfilled this duty admirably. The Irish giant continued where Stirling had left off. Operations continued, successes came. The SAS fought until the end of the North Africa campaign and made significant contributions. By mid-1943, the war in North Africa had ended. The Allies were victorious. Rommel's Africa Corps became history. And in this victory, the SAS's contribution was too significant to be underestimated. But the SAS's story didn't end there. On the contrary, a new chapter opened. In 1944, the SAS was sent to Italy and then to France. Before and after D-Day, they carried out critical operations: sabotage behind enemy lines, reconnaissance, and support for resistance movements. On every front, in every operation, the SAS was there. Paddy Mayne became a legendary figure during this period. Medals for bravery came one after another. He made history with 4 distinguished service orders. This was a very rare honor in the British Army. One of Mayne's operations was particularly memorable. In France, when his team was ambushed, Mayne single-handedly charged into enemy fire. He carried his wounded men to safety one by one on his back. He was nominated for the Victoria Cross for this action, but for political reasons, he didn't receive this medal. This matter is still debated today, and many people contest this decision.
When the war ended in 1945, the SAS was officially disbanded. Many thought this special unit had now passed into history, but they were wrong. In 1947, the SAS was revived, first within the Territorial Army, then within the Regular Army. And since that day, the SAS has continued to exist as one of the world's most elite special forces. Today, the SAS operates across a wide spectrum, from counterterrorism to hostage rescue, from reconnaissance operations to direct assaults. The 1980 Iranian embassy siege showed the whole world what the SAS was. On live television, within minutes, they resolved a hostage crisis, and these images made the legend even greater. But the SAS's legacy is not limited to operations. What's more important is the concept they pioneered: small, highly trained teams capable of independent action. This idea was born in the memorandum David Stirling wrote from his hospital bed in 1941, and today, special forces in every corner of the world follow this model. The American Delta Force was directly influenced by Stirling's ideas. Its founder, Charles Beckwith, had trained with the SAS and brought this experience to America. Navy SEALs, Green Berets, and many other elite units carry the SAS's legacy. And this legacy is not limited to the military sphere. The SAS's motto, "Who dares wins," has become a philosophy of life. From business to sports, from politics to everyday life, this philosophy inspires people. David Stirling lived a long life after the war. He went into business, he undertook various ventures in Africa, but he was always remembered as the founder of the SAS. In 1990, he passed away at 74 years of age, but the legacy he left behind will live forever. Paddy Mayne's end was more tragic. After the war, he struggled to adapt to civilian life. The traumas created by war followed him. In 1955, at 40 years old, he lost his life in a car accident. Some believe it wasn't an accident, but the truth was never fully revealed. Jock Lewis remained in the desert. When he lost his life in the German aircraft attack on that 1941 night, he was only 27 years old. But his invention, the Lewis bomb, was used for decades, and his training philosophy continued to be the cornerstone of the SAS. These three men had different characters. Stirling was the visionary, Mayne was the warrior, Lewis was the engineer. But together, they changed history. And now, as I finish the story, I want to ask you a question. What made David Stirling, Paddy Mayne, and Jock Lewis heroes? Physical strength? Military training? Luck? Don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments. None of these. What made them heroes was that they never gave up, that they got up every time they fell, that they found a new path with every failure, and that they said why not in the face of every impossibility. On that stormy night in 1941, 22 of the 55 men were lost. Not a single aircraft could be destroyed. Under normal circumstances, this is an ending, but for Stirling and his men, this was just a beginning. And a few weeks later, they became the most feared force in the desert. This is not just a war story. This is proof of how powerful the human spirit can be, and this inspiration has been giving people strength for over 80 years. The SAS's story hasn't ended. Today, still in the darkest corners of the world, on the most dangerous missions, soldiers of this unit are fighting, and in each of their hearts, Stirling's spirit lives on. Who dares wins? Thank you for watching this series. If this story moved you, please like, comment, and subscribe to the channel, because there are many more untold heroic stories, and I can't wait to share them with you. In our next video, I'll tell another unforgettable story from World War II. Which story? I'm keeping that a secret for now. But I can tell you this story will surprise you, move you, and fill you with pride. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you don't miss it. See you in the next video. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye.